We're going to be chatting with Rúaidhrí O'Connor in just a moment because he was speaking to Mike Catt yesterday. He was talking about the attacking philosophy that Ireland have brought to the table. He says that the instruction given to the players is to see the picture. A lot of it comes down to the belief of the player that he makes the right decision on the back of the picture he sees, the kick, the run, the pass options, the basics in rugby. That is the message that Mike Catt was pushing yesterday. Rúaidhrí O'Connor was questioning him in that, and he was writing about it in the Irish Independent this morning. That's basically the entire message here, Rory. There's a lot of responsibility that needs to be put on the shoulders of the players.
Like, you're asking me about his philosophy. I still don't know if I could give you a firm answer as exactly what his attacking philosophy is. It very much was about what's going wrong rather than what the bigger picture is, because Ireland has scored 2 tries, one of which was really fortuitous in the 160 minutes of rugby so far. And yeah, like, you're trying to tease that stuff out, but it's not. He's not very particularly forthcoming about it. So what you've read there was kind of an answer to what are you doing to fix what's gone wrong in the first 2 games, and it was very much it's kind of like it's up to the players. We're going to give them a framework, and we are obviously here to help them, but they have to make the decisions at the time, and they need to get better at trusting themselves. And he was also asked, are you less prescriptive than Joe Schmidt's team was? He said, look, there is a structure there, but the game has shifted somewhat in the last 5 years. He said we only had 7 attacking lineouts against Wales in the entire 80 minutes. So having really good power plays and attacking weapons off those lineouts is not as valuable as it used to be. What players need to be able to do is counter-attack well, is to make good split-second decisions, when to pass, when to kick, when to run, which is very similar to what Andy Farrell said on Friday when he was asked about the same stuff as well. So yeah, the onus is very much being put onto the players. The coaches are there to help them, but ultimately what they want is the players who we know are good from their previous performances and even the performances this season for the provinces and sometimes for Ireland in the pre-Christmas period, that they need to see the space and they need to move the ball to the space. And this idea of heads up rugby, I would have a fear that the players have been have come up through a system that's been very much shaped from the top down by Joe Schmidt, that every coach in Ireland almost copied him because he was so successful, and that all of the schools teams that are successful would have been very, very had their play predetermined, that would have had a very strict script that they would have played to, and it looks very good when it comes off. And now they've been given a license at the very top level when there's less time and space, and that's possibly where it's going wrong. But yeah, we didn't get really to the bottom of where the strategy is, because it was very muddled last Sunday week. It was Gary Owen off first phase, then they were sending Keith Earls up for big contacts, and when you should be sending your number 8 potentially. It just didn't make a lot of sense to the kind of naked eye and even on review. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of up to the players to bail them out, and that's almost what he said.
When you said that Joe Schmidt philosophy had permeated all different areas of Irish rugby, was Pat Lam's Connacht team essentially then an outlier? Is what we're seeing at the moment from Connacht and to a certain extent from Leinster an outlier from that drip down of Joe Schmidt thinking all the way through Irish rugby?
Yeah, well, like Pat Lam went to Connacht, and I think Pat Lam is someone who saw Connacht and the strengths and weaknesses of that province and said, well, we can't compete doing the same thing as everyone else. Our budget is far smaller, our facilities aren't as good. We've got to find our own way and our own identity. And Pat Lam is someone that I would have hoped that the IRFU would have been calling when Joe Schmidt was leaving to see if he had any interest in coming in and taking the job. But the succession plan was already in place, and Andy Farrell has been given that task. And it's the way Connacht play, the way Connacht approach things, the manner in which they attacked at every moment. The times down the sports ground where they refused to kick, even when everyone, even the TV commentators were screaming at them to kick the ball, like that worked for them, and it just showed that an Irish team can do it a different way. That was kind of a ragtag bunch in many ways. It was obviously the core of Connacht players, but there was a load of AIL cast off, so there was players who kind of been around the block and have been picked up by Connacht along the way, and he kind of forged a real identity there. And it just, you're right, it did show. Like Leinster at the moment, it's probably more structured than that. I think they do put an awful lot of emphasis on unstructured play and training. They have these Tuesdays where Lancaster will basically swallow the whistle and give them long periods of play where they just have to adapt. Ireland have less time to do that in training. They just don't have the prep time. that clubs do, but that can't be an excuse either. These are best players, have been the best players at every level of their development. They should be able to make, and I think this is what Andy Farrell and Mike had, who are brilliant players themselves, and I wonder sometimes does that feed into them. They're looking at these guys who've been the best players in their teams the whole way up. They're the best players in their provinces. And they're saying to them, go and make plays, go and see the space, go and make the right decisions at the right times. And at the moment, our best players are struggling with that.
Rory, it's Will here. Just in terms of the kind of unstructured play, you look at last weekend, and I know a lot of people were frustrated on Sunday afternoon when it was the same squad as the week previously and that no changes were made. But you look at two players who are perhaps big name omissions in terms of their form, and two of them play in a very unconventional way compared to the Irish style, and that'd be Jack Carthy and John Cooney. You know, we saw Cooney with a really good offload in Ulster's win on Friday night, and he was trying to recycle possession when he had the ball. And Jack Carthy was taking the ball into possession. He was taking control and driving Connacht on. Particularly look at that second Wootton try, where I think he had 11 possessions during it. Is the way that they're playing one of the reasons that they're not getting into the Ireland squad currently?
It's very hard to get a read on why those two players are in. And I mean, I think what they did, they picked a kind of a hierarchy where Conor Murray was first choice, and Gibson Park is Gibson Park is a very good bench option. And I think he's picked as a bench option. And they've got Casey in there to learn and to experience things. But when Murray went down, I know it was late in the week, they were left with starting their bench option and bringing the kid onto the bench for a massive game. And whereas they've got Cooney was drafted in late and was sitting in the stand, and the game that they tried to play where Gibson Park was kicking the ball an awful lot suited Cooney down to the ground. They had Billy Byrne starting, who's not the goal kicker at Ulster because John Cooney's a better goal kicker. I think you're completely right. I think for whatever reason, and they have had a good look at John Cooney, who was in throughout the first half of last year. I think it's a year to the date since Ireland's last game in front of crowds last year in England, where Cooney would have been involved. And also Luke McGrath, I think, is another player who is probably a more structured player, but is also very well able to run the game from 9 and would be able to maybe take the pressure off those inexperienced 10s. I've almost given up banging the drum for Cooney because I just don't think it's going to happen at this stage. They've obviously taken an opinion on him. And Carthy's almost the same. I mean, I'm told it's not because of the Japan game. I'm told it's because they feel Ross Byrne's kicking is better and Billy Byrne's handling is better. I think what they would like is a combination of Ross Byrne and Billy Byrne's, because I think they're both, Billy Byrne's kicking is not as good, is not at the level, and I don't think Ross Byrne's attacking player is at the level. I think Carthy, other than Johnny Sexton, if you're going to go for an established guy in his 20s rather than a young up-and-coming kid who I would have called for, but at this stage it's obviously not going to happen in this Six Nations, Carthy is the most complete of all the packages. He's obviously very confident. He's been there. He's got a point to prove. I think the way I think Ireland would have been better served with Cooney and Carthy playing together against France than they were with Gibson Park and Burns. But they almost went, the way they named their squad at the start and the decisions they've taken has almost nailed them to the players that they have. And Kat did say yesterday, we don't want to chop and change mid-tournament. And I can understand that, because clearly they're not bringing in a flood of new guys for this game because they're trying to build cohesion so that they can finish strong and earn the prize money that they need to keep the show on the road, which, it does have to be part of the conversation for all the, I can sit here and play fantasy rugby and call for different players to be called in. There is a reality for Andy Farrell that, unless David Nucifora rings him and says, your job is safe, I want you to plan towards next season and 2023, which I don't think has happened. I think the imperative on Andy Farrell is go and win these games, and he's trying to do it with the squad that he has. But I think it's a very valid point that I haven't heard answered convincingly just yet.
Yeah, and I can understand that Andy Farrell at the outset of this tournament probably had 40-odd players that he saw as a core group. If they're all fit, that they're going to be the players that he's going to use. But you would imagine there has to be a certain amount of flexibility for form here. Like, you look at Coombs, who has more tries than any of the rest of the forwards who are currently included. Even I mentioned Alex Wootton, who's having a huge breakthrough season for Connacht, and you saw the form he was in at the weekend. If you're going to have players playing for their provinces and playing in form, surely if they're playing that well, they're the people you should be having a look at. Unfortunately,
this seems to be a reflection on the Pro 14 and where the Ireland coaches see the Pro 14. Like Coombs has played European rugby. He was one that I was surprised wasn't in at the start. They brought him in for a week and took a look at him. My understanding is that they feel like if these guys are not going to play, and I think there's an argument for playing Coombs because I think he is. I talked to Stephen Ferris for a piece. I know you guys have him on later in the week, but I spoke to Stephen Ferris for a piece last Saturday. he reckons Coombs has more in his tank than either Rhys Ruddock or CJ Stander in terms of his ability to change pace, his dynamism. He actually reminds me of Ferris more than any other player we've had, Ireland have had since. But they've taken a position that these players are better off being back in their provinces, playing week to week. And they seem pretty optimistic we will have a summer tour this summer. They can then start that change. Then I would have a concern that they're wasting a World Cup cycle here. That that it's going to be too late. And whatever about funny. I've only watched half an hour of Connacht. I haven't caught up on it fully yet. In the first half an hour, Alex Wootton doesn't look like a guy who's shooting lights out. There's a couple of bits in there that you're kind of. I've watched the first half an hour going, what happens here? Because Connacht are under a lot of pressure when I stopped. And I'm going back to watch the rest of it today. But yeah, I think the 2 weeks of European rugby before this started being cancelled was a big blow to a lot of players who would have had an opportunity to play at the level where the Irish management feel like they're being tested at a level that's more similar to the test level. At the same time, this is an imperfect world we're living in. If these players, and I think certainly Coombs, Harry Byrne, and one or two others are the kind of players who are going to be playing in next year's Six Nations and potentially leading the charge to the 2023 World Cup, I think they should be in now. And I think particularly now that the title is gone, there should be a leeway to go and do it. They've taken the position that they want to win these last 3 games and finish 4th or 3rd, which, as I said, there's $1 million or $2 million in the difference of prize money between those positions, and in the financial situation there is. But I would question the logic that you can't win without him. I think that you're on a bit of a loser if you're not trying them and you're kind of losing or producing middling performances with the same old. You're really achieving mediocre results and learning very little at the same time.
What Andy Farrell will say to that is that Harry Byrne simply isn't ready. And it's not just because of his age, it's because he hasn't played an awful lot of rugby over the past couple of months. He says that he hasn't had the opportunity to get fully bedded into camp and that it would be guesswork. And that's quoting from Andy Farrell last week. It would be a guess to throw Harry Byrne into the fold this weekend against Italy. Do you buy that? Do you agree with that? Do you think it's the right way to be approaching things, especially in the context of a World Cup cycle?
Well, I think that's Andy Farrell's genuine position, and I think he is feeling like he talked about relishing the pressure last week. He gave a great quote that I've slipped my mind about. It's kind of one that I think will be nailed up whether he fails or whether he wins, about how he embraces the pressure. And I buy it. I do think that is his reason for it. I think I am convinced, and I have good reason to be convinced, that long term he sees Harry Byrne as a test out half, and he would see him and Joey Carberry as probably the number 1 and 2 at the next World Cup if Johnny Sexton doesn't make it. And I think they see a role for Sexton in that, but the 2 other players aren't there. And obviously we talked about, last time I was on, we mentioned Paddy Jackson, and the RFU succession plan has been thrown off kilter by the fact that Paddy Jackson is unavailable and Joey Carberry has been injured for so long. And I accept all of those reasons. I think there is a time and a place for a coach to be bold and to take a chance on a player if that player is, there's a kind of an argument there, and I think it is true that if he had played against Northampton in that European game where he cried off late and played well and then kept the jersey over the next couple of weeks, and probably the European games that happened, there's a scenario there where Harry Byrne will be in the matchday squad, like Craig Casey is possibly going to be this week. That didn't happen because of a stroke of bad luck for Harry Byrne in the warm-up, and then COVID, claimed a couple of games. Sometimes you got to change the destiny yourselves. You can't be relying on provincial coaches who have very different goals and are operating on they're on 1 year cycles. Like Leo Cullen can afford to be very patient with Harry Byrne because he doesn't need Harry Byrne until next year or the year after to be starting those big games. Whereas Andy Farrell is in the middle of a 4-year cycle where he needs to win now as well. I think if you pick a strong team full of experience and you put Harry Byrne in the middle of that, behind a really good pack, beside Conor Murray, inside Robbie Henshaw, with a load of players that he's familiar with outside him, and you give him front football against a team that Ireland beat by 50 points back, two months ago, and haven't lost it since 2013, and have been hockeying left, right and centre pretty much ever since that game in 2013. Like, we do have to remember, I know Andy Farrell said this is a dangerous game. This is Italy. They haven't won a game in nearly 30 games in Six Nations. They're decided to play loads of kids in the Six Nations, so Harry Byrne's going to be facing the lads who are younger than him. Like, I buy it because I understand where Andy Farrell's coming from, but I'm concerned by the conservatism of it. I think there should be more ambition and forward thinking in it, while accepting the prize money and all of those things that are there. And I heard Neil outline a very coherent and well thought out argument. I just disagree with it. I don't think Ross Byrne and Harry Byrne I don't think Ross Byrne and Billy Burns are going to be the answer now or next year. I think it's time to skip a generation as long as Carberry's not fit. If Carberry comes back this weekend and we come out of this Six Nations window with Carberry playing for Munster, that changes the picture and probably allows Ireland to be more patient. And maybe they have information on Carberry that says, hang on a second, we think we're going to get this guy back. Let's hold off on the kid. We'll get through with the players that we have. I think Sexton's in decline. I don't think he's as good as he was. And I think the players who are beneath Sexton right now, who are in the squad, are not of the level and are not going to get to the level. So why persist with them and give them the minutes and the valuable caps that you could be investing in a player who's younger?
Just to bring this full circle then, and to go back to what Mike Catt was saying yesterday about heads-up rugby and expecting spark from their players, does that make it harder if you're Harry Byrne making your debut for Ireland, being expected to provide that sort of spark?
Yeah, I mean, it makes it harder, but he's a very confident kid. He's a very strong, attacking player. I think he does have his attacking game already is stronger than Billy Burns and Ross Byrne in the way he attacks line. I know he got a lot of criticism for his not criticism necessarily, but people were pointing out the weaknesses in his game on Friday night and on a horrible pitch at Rodney Parade. But in the build-up to Leinster's first try, he showed exactly what he does have in terms of the way he challenged the line. He obviously needs to tidy up the kicking that went wrong in that game. He needs to be more prominent. He needs to be more forceful in terms of stepping up and commanding the game. I guess his older brother was alongside him as well, and maybe there's that's probably a risk to flag that as I don't have a brother. I've never I can't really step into his shoes in that regard. But is he confident enough that he's going to tell Ross to get out of the way and order him around? How does that dynamic work? That is a strange one. There are bits that he needs to tidy up, but I do think in terms of his attacking game and his ability to link and to throw good passes, to play on the line, he's obviously going to be under more pressure at international level, but we won't know until he gets there. So, I mean, it is engaging in hypotheticals at this stage because he's not in there, he's not in the squad. He's playing against Glasgow on Sunday. And again, that's Ireland wanted to play against Glasgow on Sunday, play against Ulster the following week, and what's actually, a pretty significant game for Leinster, even though it's in the middle of the Six Nations. And come out, I think they almost hope that by the time Ross Byrne and Johnny Sexton go back to Leinster have a serious decision on their hands because Harry has been so good while they've been away. The concern is that it's going to be too late for Ireland. But I think we would learn an awful lot about Harry Byrne by putting him into this environment and challenging him to do that. And I think, being backed by Andy Farrell with his arm around them, saying, "I think you're the guy for the long term. I want you to go out there. You'll make mistakes, but that's not your problem. That's on the 14 experienced guys around you to clean that up for you. But I think you're a match winner and you're going to do it for me." That's the way I'd like to see him approach it, but unfortunately they've gone a different way.
Rory, the first couple of rounds of the Six Nations, thankfully, were fairly unaffected in the grand scheme of things by COVID-19. But COVID-19 is going to be a dominant story probably now until tomorrow afternoon when a decision is going to be made about France against Scotland. On the face of it, you're looking at almost a dozen people affected now inside the French camp. To me, it seems unlikely that game can go ahead this weekend. But the Scots, with their statement last night, are pretty insistent that they're planning for this game to take place on Saturday.
Yeah, I mean, Scotland, I think, have 10 players who are based in England, and the international regulations in terms of calling those players up are they're allowed to do it this weekend because of the Six Nations window, but the following weekend, those players are all required to go back to their clubs. And, you get into very tricky territory for the SRU there. It's one of the drawbacks of having, players based abroad. While there is some, benefit of having, say, Stuart Hogg at Exeter and him winning. So there's major doubt. I think it's fair to say Ireland seem to have had a massively lucky escape in the fact that Raphael Ibanez, the French manager, has said that they may have picked it up in Dublin. They trained with the French sevens team the week before they came to Dublin. The sevens team, I think, are all in isolation, or all probably coming out of isolation soon because they all started reporting cases over that weekend or on the Monday after. Galtier was the first to report a positive on the Monday. Ireland have had 4 rounds of testing since, and they've all come up negative, and they haven't been identified as close contacts because of the way that the stadium is managed, and they didn't spend much time indoors with them. It's probably just as well there wasn't many scrums on the day. like that are. But I think Ireland can count themselves quite lucky that they're not in any way affected by this, and they seem to be okay going to Rome. But yes, that game is definitely in doubt. I mean, France were able to rotate their entire squad out and bring in 15 new players and go to England and nearly beat them in the Autumn Nations Cup. Even like the player, I can't remember his name, that they called up as a replacement yesterday, turned up, they tested him, and he was positive because he had been 24th man in Dublin and had travelled as a reserve. So they're now relying on players coming in from the outside who've been in the community, who've been in their clubs, and coming in, and also that there aren't players who've caught it off their teammates over the last couple of weeks. They're preparing. I think they're doing kind of. They're still training, but they're not doing full on. They're training with some element of distance and trying to contain whatever is in their camp as well. So that's obviously going to affect their performance if they do not manage to pull this off. Six Nations is so big and so important and so valuable that you wonder whether they'll find a way. I know Scotland have said they definitely won't, but the TV companies will surely have a role to play in this and saying, we've paid too much money for this to be basically a cancelled game that Scotland get 5 points from, which I think will be the scenario if we go off other tournaments. So the most sensible solution will be to play it the following week. But if Scotland can't play 10 of their players because of that, then they lose out. And maybe France will have to pay the English clubs for the Scottish players. There might have to be a workaround in that regard. I don't know. But yeah, it's very messy. I think it was inevitable that COVID was going to strike at some stage. Fiji missed almost the entire Nations Cup. And no one really, people got on with it possibly because Fiji don't have a massive media presence in this part of the world and aren't traditionally in our tournaments. So kind of the show went on. But it was always going to be, if one of the big guns got into this situation, it was going to get tricky. So that's where we are now. And yeah, the decision, the COVID, or I think it's the testing committee is meeting again tomorrow to make a final decision. I mean, you also have to wonder whether it's safe for the Scottish players to play against France this weekend. That has to be taken into consideration. Whether the Scottish, the safety of them going to the stadium staff, all of these things, it's much bigger than that. And if there's any safety risk, you would think the game will have to, just can't go ahead, really.
All right, Rory, thanks a million for taking the call this morning. Appreciate it.
Cheers, lads.
Rúaidhrí O'Connor there, rugby writer with the Irish Independent, and you can check out his work in the paper this morning. You can also check out Andy Dunn in the OTB podcast network or on the OTB YouTube channel. He was with Joe last night, and coming up over the course of this week, our build-up to Italy sees us chatting to Stephen Ferris on Thursday morning, and Ronan O'Gara and Alan Quinlan will be on air together on Friday morning's OTB AM ahead of Ireland against Italy. It is 8:15 on this Tuesday morning, and a packed show still to come.